Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on a genuinely fascinating structural problem. We aren't going to be looking at politics, polling data, or individual leadership styles. Instead, we're focusing on the exact point where organizational responsibility actually lands in practice. We're going to explore the crisis that occurs when an organization's promise outpaces the structure that is meant to carry it.
So here is the million-dollar question. What really happens when a mandate becomes glaringly visible, but the architecture beneath it simply isn't ready? It's a classic absolute core executive dilemma, and it's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture a highly visible, though for our purposes, anonymized public case. A head of government comes into office riding the wave of a massive election victory. And they don't just promise a shift in tone or better communication, they promise a totally new era of implementation. We're talking highly measurable missions, shorter waiting times, more housing, tighter security, clean energy, and a really heavy push toward digital reform and AI-enabled public services. The goals are incredibly visible, in fact, maybe even a little too visible.
Because when things inevitably start to stall, it is so easy to misdiagnose the situation. From the outside, we usually apply completely the wrong frame. We point fingers, right? We call it a lack of leadership. We blame poor communication, or we say there's a deficit in political will. But the actual disease, it's much harsher. It requires a structural diagnosis. The issue isn't the personality of the leader. It's the state architecture practically cracking under the weight of the actual service case. Here is the absolute core truth you have to keep in mind. A mission only becomes viable when it can be structurally carried in the actual service case. Think about that. It doesn't become real in a beautifully written speech, it doesn't happen in some polished strategy document, and it certainly doesn't become real just because it was an election mandate. Viability is tested in concrete, physical reality. The structure proves itself exactly where a patient is sitting in a room waiting for a bed, where a housing permit is delayed on someone's desk, where a border is actively being controlled, where a citizen actually interacts with the state, or where an AI system is quietly preparing a casework process. This is the exact front line where an organization has to decide, explain, escalate, or limit. And that brings us to the real beating heart of this explainer, the MSH node. This stands for the mandate, service, and liability intersection. This single node strictly defines structural accountability right at the point of service delivery. If this node isn't functioning, well, the entire structure fails to carry the promise. Let's break down exactly how this works in practice, because it's super important. First, you have the mandate. Who is actually allowed to make the decision at that exact moment? Second, the service. Which public service must work and for whom? Third, liability, and this one is critical. Who is genuinely accountable for the effects, the errors, or the delays? And finally, judgment. Is there a working feedback loop? Does the system learn fast enough when those boundary cases inevitably go wrong? So, returning to our highly visible public case, the primary failure pattern wasn't that they lacked ambitious goals. Not at all. The issue was a critical lack of structural coverage. The political mandate became visible way faster than the state architecture could prove it could actually carry the service case. Basically, the promise completely outpaced the structure. When that gap opens up, it triggers what I like to call the personalization cascade. It goes like this. First, the structure fails to carry the functional responsibility. But that weight has to go somewhere, right? It doesn't just vanish. So secondly, it gets personalized directly onto the individual leader. And ultimately, a fundamental system failure is unfairly but almost inevitably framed as a personal leadership flaw. You can actually spot this happening in real time through a few key symptoms. When structure is uncarried, suddenly every single waiting time becomes a question of the leader's capability. Every gap in implementation transforms into a crisis of public trust. Standard blockages in reform get twisted into debates about the leader's character, and everyday operational trade-offs, they become dramatic questions of whether the person is still strong enough to lead. But the right diagnosis asks, was the architecture viable enough? Not, was the person strong enough? Which, of course, naturally leads us to the favorite modern silver bullet everyone immediately reaches for. Does artificial intelligence automatically solve this structural accountability gap? I mean, does plugging in AI just magically fix the MSH node? The answer to that is a pretty resounding no. Look, AI is an incredible accelerator. It's going to prepare appointments, vastly speed up administration, structure complex casework, and even pre-shape decisions. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. AI cannot automatically solve that mandate service liability node. It literally cannot create structural accountability. It can't stand up in a press conference and answer for errors or delays, and it absolutely cannot replace a functional order of responsibility. In fact, honestly, integrating AI without fixing your underlying structure is downright dangerous. AI increases the density of contributions, makes handovers highly visible, and accelerates those pre-decisions. But here is the key takeaway. If the mandate, service, liability, and feedback loops are not structurally built in first, AI doesn't just scale your performance. It scales your structural undercoverage. It just takes your existing flaws and magnifies them exponentially. This leads us to a really fascinating concept, the public centurio. Under maximum visibility, a leader essentially becomes a public centurio. This is someone who pays functionally, and let me be clear, not therapeutically, not psychologically, but functionally, for an organization's structural undercoverage. Their public profile basically becomes the ultimate shock absorber for all that system friction. And the toll this takes, it's incredibly high. The leader pays with their time, which gets completely swallowed by an accelerated crisis tempo. They pay with extreme reputational exposure. They start facing intense loyalty conflicts, feeling stretched between their party, the state, the administration, and the public. Their operational maneuverability shrinks down to almost nothing, and they're placed under constant punishing public judgment, all because the underlying structure didn't carry the initial promise. Now, even though we've been using a government case to illustrate this, don't think for a second this is just a political issue. This exact same structural pattern exists everywhere. It happens in hospitals, it happens in insurance companies, it plagues public administrations, utility providers, and corporate shared services. Literally any service-based organization operating under the intense pressure of reform, digitization, or AI implementation is going to face this exact same dynamic. So let's lock in our core diagnostic principles. If you're an executive or just a focused learner trying to apply this, you need to remember these 4 maxims. First, a goal is not yet a carrying form. Second, a mandate is not yet a service architecture. Third, an AI lever is not yet an order of responsibility. And finally, and this one is huge, early visible success is never actual proof that the structure can carry the weight long term. When organizations finally realize they're failing to carry their promises, panic usually sets in. And what do? They slap on another reform label, they launch a massive new PR push, or they go out and buy another expensive AI program. But the only viable next step, the only one that works, is a comprehensive coverage check. We literally need to check if the structure actually covers the promise at the exact moment of use. So, how do we actually do this? Part 1 of the coverage check is all about mapping. You have to ask, which strategic mission lands in which exact physical service case? At that specific point of service, who actually holds the mandate to decide? And crucially in today's world, which AI contributions are operating in the background, pre-shaping those decisions? Then we move to part 2, which focuses strictly on liability and feedback. Who actually has to stand up and explain the effect of the service? Who is functionally accountable when there are errors, delays, or when the wrong priorities are set entirely? And finally, does the system actually learn fast enough from the things that go wrong? Look, if you can't answer these confidently, your structure is undercovered. It's that simple. To make this totally actionable right now, take these 3 questions straight back to your leadership team. 1. Which of our highly visible strategic missions currently outpace our actual ground-level service architecture? 2. Where are we currently treating a structural undercoverage problem as if it were just a personal leadership flaw? And 3. As we're integrating AI, are we actually updating our liability structures to match it? Which leaves us with our fundamental thesis for today. Structure first, not AI first. Because if you don't build the architecture to carry your promise, you are inevitably going to pay for it with your reputation. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to really ponder. Is your organization currently relying on the sheer personal strength of its leaders to mask the profound weakness of its structures? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep structuring, and we'll see you next time.